Well, good afternoon or good morning still, everyone. This is, I think, really an exciting topic. And the topic of today's program is Global Gateways, Miami's growing role connecting Dubai and the GCC to Latin America and beyond. Obviously, all of you have witnessed the transformation of Miami in so many respects. It's really been an extraordinary, maybe half a decade. We'll see, I think, some of what has been playing out just in the last few years, what's playing out right now will unfold in the coming years. But I think one of the truly exciting things that's happened is this internationalization of Miami and how Miami has really become a gateway not only to Latin America, which has been its historic role, but also to the rest of the world. And few of the connections that have been really evolving as part of this is the connection with or as important as the connection with the GCC and the greater Middle East. This is a really meaningful one. For those of you who've been following this space, you know very well some of what has evolved and some of what has transpired just in the last couple of years. We have, of course, now a consulate for the United Arab Emirates opening here in South Florida imminently. So this is really one of the exciting areas, and I'm really excited to join the panel today as we discuss some of, I think, the potential for all of us and what it will mean for all of us in South Florida in the coming years. Each of us, as Francisco mentioned, have been engaged with the region for a very, very long time, but importantly, are homegrown, as you heard, right? We've been engaging in international business for many, many years, and as part of that, we've really been a part of opening up this community to some of the opportunities of the Middle East. So over the course of the program, we're going to try to define the opportunity, talk about some of what you need to know. What are some of the major differences between, say, the Middle East and Latin America and some of the other regions that we in South Florida have engaged with meaningfully over the last several years? And then talk a little bit about some of the regional considerations that I think those of us who are making this part of our offering, right, to our respective clients and as part of our businesses have to take into consideration. So we'll start by defining the opportunity. And I want to go first to Antonio for that, to talk a little bit about what are some of the sectors or themes that you've seen favored for investment, for the allocations by some of the players in the region here in the U.S., and how does Miami play into that?
So in my firm and in my professional capacity, our job is actually to go and present these opportunities to capital and increasingly now in the GCC throughout the region, and really to listen to what it is that they're looking for. Selling stuff is hard, so it's a lot easier if people tell you what they want and then you go find it. And the clear preferences that we have seen, and they've been relatively stable in the 5 years that we've been building a presence intentionally in the market, are U.S. real estate, but not, of the flavor of condos on Brickell or on the beach or things like that. It's really the theme is infrastructure. They're looking for infrastructure. They're looking for ways to deploy capital. Number one, really big tickets. They don't deploy, $500,000 to $5 million tickets the way that a Latin American family office might. So infrastructure, defense tech, health tech. They have moved up the chain over time from early stage venture to now something that would look more like growth equity. A lot of telecom, and increasingly, and where we've decided to focus to sort of plant our flag in the region, is on everything related to food security, but not buying food as a customer, but rather investing in a way where they are controlling the entire value chain from the source all the way to the infrastructure in their region. Those are the things that they view, I would say, as not nice to haves, but as need to haves.
Right. And you mentioned a few of the different sectors that are really kind of the strategic sectors that the folks in that region are looking at as far as investing in the U.S. more broadly. And I want to sort of dovetail on that, Pepe. I know that Jose, I should say, we've known each other since college, so we go a couple different ways on this. But Jose, if I can ask you maybe just to talk.
He's much older than me. He was
right. Exactly. If you could talk a little bit about the different sectors that you're seeing as sort of a meaningful part of the conversation between the Middle East and the U.S., the Gulf and the U.S., and really particularly focused here on Miami.
Well, I guess I wanted to start off by stating something that we might not often think about when we think about the connection, which is between 1860 and 1915, over 500,000 Arabic speakers moved to Latin America. So any of us that do work in Latin America, whether it's in Brazil or Argentina or Colombia, you know that you've probably met people of Arabic descent, Middle East descent in your time there. So there's always been, I think, a flirtation between the two regions. And what I'd like to talk about for a second is the politics of what's going on, because during the Trump administration, Florida has become to Washington what Chicago was for Obama. It really was the breeding ground of the leadership and the thought leadership, and Miami happens to be at the center of that. So I think what we've seen in Trump 1 and now in Trump 2 is a Floridaization of the cabinet. You have the speaker's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, coming from Jacksonville, the deputy chief of staff, James Blair, coming from Polk County in Tallahassee. You have Marco Rubio very much involved. Our former attorney general is now the attorney general of the United States. So you have a lot of interest from the Middle East and from the GCC in Florida, because Florida is hot. And what is hotter than Miami? Nothing. So everybody wants to be in Miami. They want to be close to Mar-a-Lago. That creates opportunities. Just the spillover of those conversations that are happening at the highest level are leading things to like FII choosing Miami as a second home. With the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, you have the investment ministry of Saudi Arabia opening an office here. And what are they looking at? Anything and everything. I mean, obviously, infrastructure, like Antonio said, is the name of the game these days with AI. Last year's FII seminar focused exclusively on AI and data centers and energy opportunities. I know that the UAE is looking at investing significant dollars in interconnectivity of the energy grid. There's a group called K&K Group that's really focusing on that all over Latin America and the Caribbean. And then, massive trade opportunities, investment in ports and airports, and privatization of roads. There's a ton of opportunity happening right now all across the region. And I think with Marco Rubio becoming Secretary of State, there's like a renewed focus on the Western Hemisphere. I don't think in the history of this country we've had a Secretary of State that understands the region as well as he does. So his singular focus on things like Venezuela and Cuba are creating additional opportunities for friends in the GCC that all of a sudden have plays in Venezuela that didn't exist 6 months ago. That's just the beginning of the conversation. I'm sure we'll explore it further.
I know, I agree. And when shortly after the election, a colleague of mine who focuses on the region called me and he said, well, get ready because South Florida is going to be the center of the world for the next several years. And I was sort of taken aback by that. But in a sense, I wasn't really thinking through what this meant. The fact that you had essentially, the cabinet of the president mostly being comprised or significantly being comprised of Floridians, and the president himself and his entire senior leadership spending so much time in South Florida, what that would mean for us here in South Florida. And this also happened at a time, Jose, as you mentioned, where Miami itself was coming into its own, really the culmination of this 20-year growth spurt that we've really now been riding for quite a while, with some ups and downs along the way. But the maturation of Miami as a global marketplace during the pandemic coincided with suddenly this concentration, global focus on South Florida that was born of the fact that you had a South Floridian president.
If there isn't a better example of that, we're in Miami-Dade College. Miami-Dade College gave land back to the state to put the Trump Presidential Library in Miami. And in that library, we believe there will be a Air Force One that was donated by Qatar. So that's not the most Miami thing ever. I don't know what is.
Well, it's true. One of the things that we've talked about, and Yolanda and I have had a lot of opportunities to talk about what Miami means, right, in terms of the global, presence of the U.S. But one of the things that I think you're seeing play out, and all of you are part of this, is that Miami is, like Dubai, one of the newest global cities. And what does that mean? It's people like yourselves, many of whom have come to Miami from elsewhere and are bringing your talent, and many of you bringing considerable treasure as well, and deploying it here, but deploying it from here as well, and looking beyond. This has been the story of the last 5 years. And there's no question when, now people talk about Miami, they talk about Miami in the same breath as they might have 25 or 30 years ago about places like Singapore, places like Hong Kong. These are global capitals of capital. I think our mayor, our former mayor, who I know is one of the speakers later today, talks about Miami as the capital of capital. One of the major players, obviously, in this discussion, particularly when you think about the GCC, are the major sovereign wealth funds that have really an outsized presence in this sort of expression, this global expression of economic activity that's really emerging from that region. And I know, Yolanda, you could tell us a little bit about some of what you've been doing to build the bridge between the GCC and here. But also, if you could talk a little bit about your work with some of the sovereign wealth funds and your experience working with them.
Sure. So I heard something's hot. What's really hot is the deployment of capital. And I'm also a banker. It's just such an amazing time. I just came back from Saudi Arabia, I think a week and a half ago. And, the fact that particularly three countries, if we're talking about the GCC as a whole, so UAE, if you're talking about Saudi and Qatar, which are probably the three that have committed to deploy and pledge for almost $4 trillion in assets. And if we're looking at what that equivalent means, that equivalent is the same GDP as India for 2026. So it's a large amount. But the deployment will be happening over a span of time, right? So it'll be between 2025 and 2035. So why is it relevant to us? So I'm also the co-founder of a chamber called the Miami Chamber of Commerce Dubai. And also we've created recently the Miami Chamber of Commerce Riyadh, because we recognize that Miami and Dubai are gateway cities, right? So they're gateways, not necessarily final destination, but centers where this capital comes to, this capital is deployed. And particularly the sectors and these sovereign wealth funds that have, the ministries have opened offices, as mentioned here. They have opened offices because also they want also funds to go the other way as well. So that's probably the primary reason why they've opened the offices. But the unique opportunity to bring tier one firms and different types of sectors from the U.S., and that's where we've started expanding in trade missions to bring them over, whether it's mainly Dubai and Riyadh, to explore all the opportunities. So these sovereign wealth funds, I think if you're going to look at three sovereign wealth funds, I would really look particularly those that are now exploring the region. The PIF, which is the Public Investment Fund, it's probably the most aggressive in terms of the deployment. But also, Mubadala and Adia in UAE as well are particularly significant. And if we're talking about sectors, definitely defense. I was just at the World Defense Show. So just the amount of countries that have gone to Saudi, particularly in a hot place with a region of geopolitical risk for since, a long time, thousands years, right? Long time. So and now with Iran and talks with them that I think have ended now, since yesterday in Geneva, it is really a place that has to have that regional stabilization to be able to continue to grow that abundance. And then real estate, also the push to the World Cup in Saudi in 2034 is particularly significant with continued stadium building. And obviously the digital infrastructure as well. I mean, there's so many sectors, and then who can forget global health and wellness? I mean, that's a particularly hot sector as well in their markets. So,
and one of the things that I reflect on as well is when you look at sort of the region, this is all, I think, a realization of they needed a new act, right? There needed to be a next step. And there's a realization that, you have the first act where these countries came into being in the post sort of empire era, post empires, right? And then they became global players in the energy era, right? With natural resources that they were selling globally on a scale that obviously made them relevant geopolitically. But, one of the stories I like to tell is when I was in the region, maybe about a decade ago or so, and meeting with a person in the region who was a former government minister. And I asked him a question really that was intended to start a conversation, but I got an answer I didn't expect. And I asked him whether he was optimistic about the future of his country. And he told me that he was not. And I was sort of surprised by that because this is an extraordinarily safe, clean country that was actually quite modern in many respects. And what he talked about was the future of his country, the future of his people in a post-hydrocarbon era, which whether that happens in 10 years or more likely some point later in the future is coming. And when you think about this from a global sort of geopolitical perspective about preserving the sovereignty of his state, his perspective was, I think, an important one. And what you saw was a realization that we have to start thinking differently. And now we were on, maybe the second, decade of this major transformation that maybe arguably began in a place like the UAE, became even somewhat larger in a place like Qatar, which deployed its resources in a way to build its global presence. And now the largest of them all, the Saudis, have really broken the dam in some respects. One of the things, though, that for those of us, who are maybe accustomed to doing business all around the world, but maybe with an emphasis historically on Latin America, there are major differences, obviously, in how the financial markets and other cultural, dynamics play out in the region. So, Antonio, I wanted to go back to you. If you could talk a little bit about some of the major differences that you've encountered in your experience working in the region, as far as some of the key financial markets as between the U.S. and the GCC.
I think the main thing we encounter in my world is the extraordinarily different approach to regulation. There are many people here in financial services and in the United States. Essentially, our regulator is by design and by DNA. It is your business prevention unit. And in the GCC, from the very beginning, everything about the regulatory framework and the things that are put in front of you, whether it's a CAFT or ADGM or DIFC, it's about ensuring your success. And that is remarkable. It's almost a culture shock. Before I forget, though, I do want to highlight the importance of a couple of things that Jose Felix said. Number one, it is true. I'm from Colombia, and the very first deals that we ever did in Latin America that had any impact on the GCC were infrastructure deals in Latin America in about 2011 and 12. And all those exports were going to the port of Abu Dhabi. And the families in Paraguay who were funding this were actually Lebanese expats who had moved to Paraguay. And, we have a very large Syrian and Lebanese population in Colombia. So I guess to sort of move on, I would say the first thing is the regulatory environment is completely different and extraordinarily conducive to business. The second thing is, I think for anyone here who's looking to go to the region, what I can tell you from our experience is, I don't say this in a negative way, but in the West, we have a very transactional business culture. And in my firm, we've spent 5 years going to the GCC and we've done one deal. We've had to be very intentional about investing in relationships. And, when Yolanda talked about, the different players out there and the different funds, even right now at Mubadala, there's a lot of sort of shifting. There's a little bit of musical chairs going on. And being thoughtful about which relationships you invest in and which verticals they're going to help you to be successful in and how they're going to get you where you need to be, that's actually the majority of the game. The majority of the game is the right relationship, the right channel to where you want to go. And I would say the last thing is recognizing when you have the right offerings for it and you have something of interest to deliver, that in some regards, these jurisdictions compete with each other. And if you have the right things in your pocket and you are able to manage it correctly, that competition can be extraordinarily useful when you're taking things over there, because the moment that, Audio realizes you're looking for something, ADNOC might want it. And now there isn't haggling over your price. So I just think that's very, those are some nuances that we might not be prepared for here or accustomed to, but that are critical to understand if you want to be successful there.
I think what a great point as far as the competition, right? And we've seen how this played out, now many years ago in the context of the blockade that arose. which is now sort of ancient history. And now we're talking about a new era of competition to a degree. And as you...
Sorry,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
apologize. I just want to say one more thing before I forget. So, with regards to what Pepe said, I got back from Colombia this morning, and it is true that while there are some concerns in Latin America about some of the current policies in Washington, universally from south of the border, we find it remarkable that for one, we have the first in Marco Rubio, we actually have someone who can find Latin America on a map and actually understands to some degree how to engage with the region. And whether you agree with the politics or not, that is absolutely, it's the truth.
And so, that's a great point, and no question, I think, in what that has meant for our hemisphere, but what that's meant as well for the dynamic as between our hemisphere and sort of the global and geopolitical dynamic, right? And I know, Jose, you wanted to talk a little bit about what this means, right, for us, this global competition that's happening for the hemisphere, and within that, kind of how the Middle Eastern countries and the GCC in particular, which are really playing an outsized role in many respects as this new capital of capital, how they play into that competition.
Yeah, of course. I think that if you're watching the news and you're following what's going on, I think we're really on the verge of a second Cold War. I'm not the first to say it. A lot of people are using that term, but a second Cold War, and China just happens to be on the other side of that Cold War. And China has spent so much time and energy in the last decade investing in infrastructure in Latin America. And I think that it was a message that was lost by some administrations. They kind of let some of this hemisphere's strongest relationships that, for example, supported Taiwan, abandon their support of Taiwan and shift their allegiance to China in exchange for massive infrastructure deals in their home countries. I travel the region extensively as well. And I can tell you that, the people on the ground can tell you China's everywhere. I happened to be in Panama City 3 weeks ago or a month ago on the day that they announced that the Panamanian Supreme Court was going to kick out the Chinese from 2 of its ports in the canal. They had gotten an extension on a 25-year lease without a public procurement, and that was causing some controversy. President Trump and our former county commissioner, Kevin Cabrera, who's now ambassador to Panama for the United States, had been harping on the fact that this was an illegitimate deal, and the Supreme Court came out unanimously and said it is. Now, that means that deal will probably go out for a new public procurement, and I can tell you just by my knowledge of, the GCC, that you'll probably have some very strong competitors for that procurement coming from the GCC. And in a world of Cold War, in a world where it's China or somebody else, I think that the United States would like to see a diversity of investment in the region beyond China, because the United States can't do it alone. And when it comes to, rare earth and critical minerals, of which there is quite a significant amount in Latin America, for our national security interests, it behooves us to have, again, diversity of investment so that it's not all controlled by China. China doesn't think in 10 or 20 years. They think in 100 years, 200 years. They're in it for the long term. So if we want to, be as strong and as a vibrant an economy and as a country in 100 years when our grandkids are, hopefully roaming Miami, we better make sure that we are encouraging additional investments beyond those of our mortal enemies.
Right, no question. And of course, one of the largest port operators in the world is an Emirati company, right? And so you have a lot of different sectors that this touches on, whether it's infrastructure, construction. I mean, who or which country has done, I think, more of an extraordinary job of sort of developing its infrastructure, developing additional housing than the UAE in the last 25 years. I mean, if you look at before and after photos, for those of us here in South Florida, if you think that the cranes that we had here in South Florida back in 2005, 2006 was impressive, really just look at some of the before and after photos of Dubai. And it's in that sense, at least familiar for many of us. turning back to some of this discussion that we were having about the key differences, though, for those of you who are interested in really kind of branching out and developing some of the relationships that you heard Antonio talk about in the region, let's talk a little more, Yolanda, about some of the key differences. As someone, you've lived in the region, actually, as well, and you've lived and worked around the world. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the other maybe cultural and other differences that you've encountered in the region, and maybe how some of those differences themselves are evolving based on your recent experience in the region?
Yes, and I can, particularly as a woman, working there, and having lived there in the 90s. I mean, clearly, if we're comparing the 90s to now, it's vastly different. There was a more of a kind of religious component in terms of the Committee of Prohibition and Vice, right? So they would be around the city in the 90s. And it was, particularly as a woman, very difficult because you had to have a certain religious dress. And in 2011, actually, I opened a consulting firm in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And my business partner was the first woman that was granted permission to study law in the kingdom. So it was particularly an important time because at that point, about 11% of women were actually in the workforce. So if we're going to compare those times to now in Saudi, there's about 35% participation, which is very significant. And that's exceeded the Saudi vision, 2030 vision goals by 4%. So that is significant. And if we're looking at, and then we're saying, okay, well, what about managerial roles? So whether they're up to senior role leadership, right? So that is about 45%, which is very high, I think. But if we actually look even higher to kind of executive and board level, in the GCC as a whole, it's 1%. In Saudi, is about 2%. So that's still kind of work that they can be doing. But also in terms of just even being able to go to a restaurant and sitting all together and just simple things that we would find simple here wasn't the case in Saudi Arabia up till a few years ago. Imagine you want to drive to a business meeting, but you need a driver to be able to take you because you can't drive, that is significant. And a lot of business, it is a region of relationships. So, and a lot is done in the evening. So particularly if you're going to the majlis, which is, a kind of unification of everybody in the evening, it's mainly male and patriarchal driven, right? So if you're not even invited there, how are you going to close deals, right? So there's certain significant changes where now the Saudis have accepted women can drive, and there is that amazing openness. And then also in terms of tech, I mean, women in particularly STEM kind of jobs, right? So AI, cyber security, e-commerce, women there. And then that's what's interesting about kind of the cultural context is that because they didn't have so much ability to go out and do business, they were home actually learning about technology and being able to communicate. So actually their STEM learning is probably 3 times higher than in terms of women here. So that's something that is, an interesting, I think, result. And then in terms of board level, UAE women actually are about 14%. So that's a little bit higher. So we are seeing significant changes in that.
And so one of the things, just to go back up to a level of abstraction, when you think about the relationship between Miami and Dubai, for those of us who fly a lot, sort of hub to hub, right? And each of our cities respectively serve kind of a hub function. Just as for those of us who, and many of you in the room who've been around here for a long time, that part of the reason you have so many Latin American family offices is because many of these Latin American families have made Miami their second home, whether it was for safety, convenience, or a variety of other reasons that they might have had convenience. Dubai, in a very large way, is playing that role for other parts of the world as well. So when we think about that sort of hub-to-hub connection, right, of Miami and Dubai, and really the fact that Miami's role as a hub for Latin America and Dubai's role as a hub for let's say the greater Middle East, if you include the Middle East and maybe some of the peripheral areas around it, what are some of the areas you think that these two hubs can sort of play off one another? Antonio, I'm going to want to go to you as sort of some of the different Latin American markets that you think maybe also are building trade. You talked about Colombia earlier and Paraguay and other jurisdictions. How do you see this playing out beyond the hubs?
Part of this necessarily rides on the rails of something Pepe brought up earlier around the Belt and Road Initiative and where that stands today. So, you had sort of three different approaches. The American approach for a very long time toward Latin America was all stick. Essentially, implement these social programs or things that we want and these public policy initiatives or else. But there was never really a carrot. The Chinese effectively came in with an offer that on the surface looked like all carrot, which was, here is money, here is specialization, here is expertise. We're going to develop these things. We're going to pay for it. And then our material extraction will ride on top of the infrastructure that we're bringing here. But, as people started to look at the small print and the interest rate environment started to change, a lot of governments in the region realized that they simply couldn't keep the debt service up. And that what's been happening is that the Chinese effectively have been pushed out of a lot of these projects because the problem with having these types of assets as collateral is that you can't pick up your highway and take it home. So they're being pushed out, and the Emiratis through DP World and a lot of their logistics partners globally have taken a third approach, which has been, we're going to come in as capital. We're not here to tell people how to run their country or what social, changes to implement. We're going to come in as capital. So how does that translate into landing opportunities here? Well, the first thing is that the U.S. usually has to be a hub for at least the material goods that are extracted in Latin America and sent around the world. Part of that is due to the fact that we have a lot of infrastructure limitations in Latin America. For example, for those of you who may know Colombia, it's a beautiful country, but our topography, which is part of our beauty, is one of our biggest limitations. So if you harvest something in the middle of the country, you have to go up and down three ranges of the Andes, which split in Colombia into three fingers to get it to the coast, right? And if we try to build tunnels, essentially our current president will simply steal all of the money anyway. So, and I know that to be true because he's actually the reason my family moved here in 1985. So, the opportunity has to do with commodities. It has to do with aggregation, and it has to do with the fact that we are a natural stop for just about everything. So to give you an idea, most of the ships, we just opened two gorgeous new double China-Max ports in Colombia, which were mostly privately funded and regionally funded by the government of the region I'm from. And that has made it possible to take a certain type of ship that's a little bit bigger than we used to be able to take. But you're aggregating, you have to bring things here. Things are going to Tampa, Jacksonville, Miami, and on the East Coast, maybe as far north as either Savannah or New Orleans. You aggregate here, and then you put it on the big China Maxes and the big, the newer like 50,000 container ships. And that's how you take it halfway around the world and you get economics. Florida continues to be a necessary hub for that. We're also an important hub in terms of legal jurisdiction, which means that a lot of the financial transactions have to go through here, or maybe not necessarily Florida. It's a lot of Delaware LLCs. But the point is that, think about it, even with Abu Dhabi and some other jurisdictions being very UK friendly and UK heavy, they're deploying capital in Latin America, which is not on the UK legal system, right? On the common law system. So the natural bridge is through here. That's an opportunity for finance, for banking, and as I said, for infrastructure. The thing we're very focused on right now, not to get very deep, has to do with food security. 5 years ago, we thought we'd go and start selling real estate, and it just turned into something completely different. If the UAE wanted to solve its food security problems tomorrow, and it could buy all of the frozen processed beef it wanted with endless supply in Central America, it would have a problem, which is that it doesn't have the cold storage infrastructure either at the source or at the end of the value chain to store it. And so for those people who are here, who are in development, who are in real estate, who are in these various areas, that's a really interesting opportunity here in the U.S., where we know that material gets aggregated anyway. and it's a very interesting opportunity over there. So for private capital, they're looking for private capital partners who deploy there. I think that's another important nuance we have to highlight here. They're sort of sick of the ATM effect where everybody, parachutes in, gets off a plane, wants to deliver a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation, go home with $100 million. They want money to go there. And if you want to deploy, to me, that seems like one of the best areas. So that's sectors and themes. Who's positioned to do it? Anyone who can deliver value at scale. The problem for an El Salvador, a Belize, or some other smaller countries is you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the production scale, you don't have the financial systems. So it's very, very difficult to compete. I think what those countries have to do is they have to come together and sort of negotiate as a commercial bloc. But the opportunities are essentially endless because your customer has an unlimited printing press and a total inability to produce what they need to consume on a daily basis locally. And on top of that, the realization that their immediate neighbors are not a solution to their day-to-day needs. So Africa is a continent that produces a lot of things, but they're simply not a reliable long-term food exporter, which means you have to stretch your chain even farther. So,
yeah, really very interesting. So you still look at the world and start drawing lines, right, between places. And at the end of the day, that is just still a fundamental reality. Just a quick example before I go to what really will be our last topic as we sort of bring this plane down to landing. One of the sort of multinational companies that I've interacted with was telling a story that I was found really just fascinated by. And in terms of how they work with the GCC, they look at some of the sovereign wealth and other players in the region as a partner to enter what they consider higher risk markets where they have less experience, but these GCC players have already been investing in infrastructure and doing other kinds of deals. So what we're talking about here is a joint venture by a known multinational to develop a business that, in this case, it's actually in the food production area, agriculture, to develop a business in a jurisdiction where they are unfamiliar, but they're leaning on the expertise. This is a second order opportunity development, right? We're not talking about just going and getting capital, but actually going to the source of capital as a joint venture because you realize that they have reached a level of global sophistication, which is absolutely true for any of us who deal with these players. The notion that they just have a bunch of expats from the UK running some of these businesses, that may have been the case 25 years ago, is less and less the case today. And they have unbelievable expertise operating in jurisdictions that many of our multinationals based here in the United States are interested in entering, but don't want to maybe do it on their own because of the risks that are involved. So the last topic I want to sort of invite the panel to speak on is a question that probably all of you are asking yourselves, which is this sort of a moment? Are we experiencing kind of this transient opportunity, or is this now a permanent feature for those of us who are growing our businesses, growing our practices, for those of us who are in the services space here in South Florida? So I want to start by turning to Jose to ask that question. 20 years from now, are we going to be talking about the GCC Miami connection, or is this just a moment that we're passing through?
I definitely think it's more than just a bubble, even though there is like a bubble element to it, where it's hot and heavy right now. And again, the Trump administration has these ties to Florida, and that can always change. But I do think there's a sense of permanency. And it's because of that diversification that Antonio was talking about, and that you were talking about, that, the GCC countries have to move beyond just reliance on petroleum. They need to really focus on long-term investments, and there's probably worse place to invest in Latin America. It's just a interesting place and amazing opportunities. And as Americans, we always vacation in Europe. For those of us that actually do vacation in Latin America, just how spectacular the region is, and any person that's doing significant business there, including our friends in the GCC, know immediately that it's a place that's going to get only better with time. with population rates increasing in Latin America and decreasing elsewhere, it's going to be a hotbed of production and opportunity. So I don't think this is a fad, but I do think that there is a bubble element to it. I'm also very intrigued about what really is or is not happening in Venezuela. I think that, the next 2 years will be determinative of that, and that's going to be a larger part of the conversation going forward.
Yeah. Any final remarks, comments, Yolanda or Antonio?
For me, partnerships. I think what was nice about bringing delegates over is that they were really received with open arms, and partnering is the best way. If you have a great local partner that's able to distribute your product, you're going to have success. They're used to dealing with everything there, whether it's regulatory, legal, just a cultural element, and they have the track record. So I think that's what we're going to see more and more of. And one thing we kind of maybe take for granted is also a lot of people from the GCC and even Saudi, particularly which was my case when I went there, mentioned to me that they've studied at American universities, and they particularly have a very strong connection to Miami and Florida as a whole. And they're proud of that, and they mentioned that in meetings. So I think that it is a great time for that type of receptivity. So let's enjoy that.
Awesome. Antonio?
Yeah, my closing thought would be that I think the relationship, the growth of the relationship between Latin America and the GCC flowing through Miami is absolutely not a bubble. I believe that with complete conviction. It will mature and it will evolve and it will change over time, but it is a relationship that is necessary for both, and that is why it can't be a bubble. It is absolutely necessary for the successful future of both, and I think my hope is that the U.S. policy vision will continue to promote this type of exchange, and also that our local policy at a state and local level will also allow us to continue to be at the center of that, because it's not just that we're lucky geographically, it's the fact that we also have all of the right conditions to be in the middle of these transactions. And if Florida decides to go the path of some other states in terms of its attitude toward international business in general, or financial markets, then that hub is very easily replaceable. So that's my thought.
Very good. Thank you, Antonio. So continue to watch this space, no question. Please join me in thanking our panel for really what has been a very interesting conversation. And thank you all as well. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.